All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. Try to check out important theories that are not really seeing the light of day, that they've been suppressed, or otherwise are outside of your purview. Today is our 277th Bible decode. All of them so far coming from the New Testament. And we've been looking at the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, that the Romans wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. We've also been looking into, and that's been covered ad nauseum over the last 150 or so videos. So if you want to check into that, see what the evidence, the mountain of hard evidence for that is, you can check that out. We've also been exploring the Dead Sea Scrolls, in particular, given the Roman origins hypothesis, because if the Roman origins hypothesis is true and the Gospels are fiction, and Josephus is also fiction, then that leaves a big vacuum for what actually was going on in the first century. And the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of fit that bill. They were discovered in the 1940s and 50s in a series of caves near Qumran, about 20 miles from Jerusalem. And unfortunately, they are treasure trove of writings, but they have been suppressed. These monks, very disciplined and ascetic, pious Jews that lived there at Qumran, at this fortress, they had many copies of different books of the Old Testament, like 20 copies of Genesis were found, and every single book of the Old Testament except for Esther, I think it was Esther. And but there's all kinds of sectarian material as well, which is material that's specific to this particular sect that lived there at Qumran, like the community rule, or the war scroll, the temple scroll, the Damascus document. These are sectarian documents that are very explosive in terms of what you can find out from them. The Old Testament copies are not nearly as explosive because they're mainly things that we already have, with maybe a word or two changed here or there, but they are historic because they are older than all of the other copies of Old Testament books that we have by centuries. Now, we are reading a book here from Robert Eisenman, who is one of the instrumental people to end this impasse of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they were basically given the custody of them was basically given to this group. Can't remember what they're called, but they were basically a group of Dominican Catholic priests, and for whatever reason they didn't like what they saw, and so they more or less refused to divulge the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these 2,000-year-old things that everybody wanted to know about. They just sat on them for like 40 years. What a crime. And eventually Robert Eisenman came along and a few others and basically forced them to at least take pictures of them and release them, and so Eisenman kind of knows these things inside and out, as well as has a very good background in many of the other ancient texts, including a lot of the Apocrypha, the Ecclesiasticus, I guess, which is one of the Apocrypha, the Pseudo-Clementine documents, the homilies, and what's the other one? The recognitions, I think it is. And then also the Qumran. So Eisenman kind of does a lot of detective work here and pieces a lot of things together to make some, make some claims that maybe aren't hard evidence, or but are things that kind of make you think. The Dead Sea Scrolls, especially in the sectarian material, they really set up a little bit of a narrative. There is the teacher of righteousness, there is the wicked priest, and there is the liar. And the liar you think of more as like an insider who is kind of leaking out bad information, whereas the wicked priest is more of an outsider. Although some people believe that they're both the same person. Now, different people, the Dominicans who were involved, they insisted that the Dead Sea Scrolls were from the 2nd century BC or the 1st century BC. They tried to distance them as far away from the gospel stories as possible. Eisenman insists that these are 1st century AD documents, so that they came out right at the time, or at least many of them came out right at the time of Jesus' so-called existence. And that he contends really that the teacher of righteousness was James, the brother of Jesus. Now, other people, like Barbara Thiering, she claims that the teacher of righteousness was John the Baptist. And then there are other people that claim that the teacher of righteousness was Jesus. So it's all very interesting. We are reading from a book that's called the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And this is kind of a compilation of some of Eisenman's shorter works, including 2 of his shorter books. And we're looking at, we're in chapter 5 of one of his books that's called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And so the Maccabees were a dynasty of Jews from the 2nd and 1st century BC, who basically took control of Judea from the Seleucids, the Greek Syrians. For a century, the Jews enjoyed some type of sovereignty, even though these Maccabees were pretty vicious, would force you to convert at the blade of a sword, and stuff like that, force you to get circumcised or killed, things like that. Those the Maccabees and their exploits are described in the apocryphal works 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and I believe there's also a 3rd and 4th Maccabees. And then the Zadokites, Zadok comes from the righteous. It means righteousness, but it comes from the high priest under David and Solomon, and then his descendants. Okay. Now he's talking about some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of these Dominicans who had made various arguments. He's talking about this guy Cross, who was one of them. And here we go. To these, I should like to add a 3rd possibility. Cross was very close to the mark when he observed that control of the Jericho road was all important, and the sectaries could not maintain themselves at Qumran in the face of Roman control over it. Okay, so he's kind of talking about the Qumran, the monastery there, or whatever you call it, fortress, was it was destroyed by an earthquake in 31 BC, and then it was re-inhabited. And I think the point that he's making is depending, he says, and the sectaries could not maintain themselves at Qumran in the face of Roman control over it. So, like, whoever was the Romans who were most prominent and who, kind of were most aggressive in their level of control, Qumran couldn't flourish during those time periods. But when there were kind of weaker rulers, such as all of these procurators, which were Herodians mostly, then Qumran flourished a bit more. But when, like, Herod the Great, or some of the other very strong leaders in Jerusalem were in control, then Qumran kind of declined. Well, let's see. But he missed the self-evident corollary of this, of which the settlement's several destructions give unmistakable proof. Only some 20-odd walking miles from Jerusalem, the monastery could not maintain itself in the face of a strong, determined central authority in Jerusalem. Alexander Jannaeus was one such ruler. He was one of the Maccabees. Herod the Great was another. The Romans under Vespasian and subsequently under Titus. Now, these are two Roman emperors of the Flavian dynasty from 69 until 81 AD. These two. And these are the two that most of the Roman origin hypothesis people believe that actually wrote the New Testament as the psychological operation. Titus's younger brother Domitian also ruled until 96 AD, and he was probably in on it for a few of the books, particularly the books of John and Acts, whereas Vespasian and Titus most likely wrote the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then later Flavians and other Roman rulers were probably responsible for the Pauline epistles, particularly Pliny the Younger, who wasn't an emperor, but he was a stepbrother of Arius Piso, who was kind of an insider of the Flavians. So the Romans under Vespasian and subsequently under Titus plainly constitute a third such determined force, as they do under Hadrian and Severus, two 2nd century Roman. I think Hadrian took over in 117 AD, when Bar Kokhba's guerrillas first occupied the site and then abandoned it and made it a more determined stand further into Wadi Marabaat, or Nahav Haver. Now, Bar Kokhba was another revolt of the Jews in 132 to 135 AD, I believe, and so this was kind of a sequel to the uprising of 66 to 73 AD that Vespasian and Titus were both generals to quell that particular revolt. And that was really what gave rise to the Gospels, according to the Roman origins hypothesis, because Vespasian and Titus were both wounded in that war, and they both recognized that the Jews were coming back, and they were very resilient, as they had been for over 100 years there, since the Romans were in control, and they wanted to do something in order to mellow out the Jews. And so as a result, they backdated the story of the Gospels by 40 years, placing it in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, about 29 AD, and they recognized that the Jews were waiting on a Messiah for Old Testament prophecies. And so instead, they proposed not a military Messiah, but a Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and turning the other cheek to oppression. And so this Jesus that was made up by Vespasian and Titus was one in order to mollify, to domesticate or tame the Jews. Okay, and so, but here Eisenman is really just talking about these emperors in terms of a strong central force that could basically make the dwellers at Qumran thrive quite a bit less. So I do not consider the period of the tetrarchies and procurators by definition to at any time have exhibited this characteristic of strong central government. So after Herod the Great, a lot of Herod's ancestors kind of divided up the various lands of Judea. And so then you have Herod Antipas, and you have Herod Agrippa, the first and the second. You have the brother Philip, and they all had control of little parts of Judea, not all of it, like Herod the Great had. And so he's saying that these they call them procurators or tetrarchies, and these people did not have the kind of central power that the Romans or Herod the Great had, and so that allowed the people at Qumran to kind of flourish. The power of the procurators probably rarely extended very far outside Jerusalem, except in occasional bursts of energy under Tiberius, Alexander, and Felix. That the monastery seems to have flourished under Alexander while it lay buried in ashes under Herod must say something. Yet majority opinion tends to identify Alexander Jannaeus as the wicked priest, while at the same time identifying the sect with the Essenes, about whom both Herod and Josephus speak with such evident cordiality. Now the story was that Herod, the Essenes were supposed to have been this very pious and, ascetic, strict, celibate sect of Jews, that Jesus was one of them, according to a lot of people, and but that Herod had a soft spot for the Essenes, even though Herod was generally hated among the Jews. He had a soft spot for the Essenes because they predicted that one day he would become the new king. So this is very much familiar with anybody who knows the Roman origins hypothesis, because that is what Josephus did to Vespasian. Josephus predicted that one day Vespasian would become emperor, and when he did, Josephus was pardoned. Josephus was really a military commander against Vespasian until he surrendered to Vespasian, saw that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans and then gave Vespasian this prophecy. Eventually, Vespasian pardoned him, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, adopted him as a member of his family, and put him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, which is pretty tall tale, if you ask me. The same thing happened with Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was the founder of Rabbinic Judaism under Vespasian as well. Vespasian gave the star prophecy, or this prophecy that he would one day become emperor, to Vespasian, or possibly Titus, and he was hooked up by getting a land grant from Vespasian to start a college, or a campus for the study of the Old Testament scriptures, and that is what eventually became the Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism. But that was a digression. Let's just get back. So basically, I don't particularly believe that the Essenes ever existed. They were only ever mentioned by Romans, like Josephus. I mean, he wasn't a Roman, but he was a Roman by adoption. Also Philo, and I believe Pliny. I'm not sure which Pliny, though. I think Pliny the Younger. They are the only people that have ever talked about the Essenes, and Josephus is the only person who ever claimed to have been a member of the Essenes. They identified Alexander Jannaeus as the wicked priest, while at the same time identifying the sect with the Essenes, the whole sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls people, as the Essenes, about whom Herod and Josephus speak with such evident cordiality. Very few specialists doubt that the sect was vociferously, even vindictively, as John the Baptist was, anti-Pharisaic. Yet the scholars' consensus insists that Alexander Jannaeus, who in his person exhibited the same characteristic, persecuted the sect, while Herod, whose open alliance with the Pharisees sponsored Hyrcanus, another one of the Maccabees, and special treatment of Pollio and Sameas, who advised the Jerusalem polity to open its gates to him, patently show to have been pro-Pharisaic, treated it with solicitude. One text at Qumran actually deals with these events, the Nahum Pesher. Now, or Pesher. A Pesher is a kind of interpretation of the text that brings in a lot of extraneous material, particularly Old Testament stuff, that is it's kind of like a decode. A Pesher is kind of like a decode of a document, a biblical document that isn't right on the surface, but you gotta have to have a lot of background information, a lot of inside knowledge to be able to make that. And so there are a few different Peshers that are part of the Old Testament scripture. There's one from the book of Habakkuk, one from the book of Nahum, and a few others. While it does not condone crucifixion per se, for reasons that in the 1st century AD should be obvious, it does not condemn the furious young lion's action, furious young lion in quotes, in taking vengeance on the members of the party who invited Demetrius into the country. The stance, rather, is very similar to that of Honi, the circle-drawing Tzaddik from the Talmud, who, when called upon to condemn the priestly supporters of Aristobulus in the next generation, who had opened the temple gates to Aristobulus and given him refuge, refuses in good Zadokite style. In return, these Herodian-aligned and Romanizing Pharisees stone him, Okay, I would just recommend not getting discouraged by all of the unfamiliar terminology. This is really kind of what you have to do with this kind of research is just get what you can out of it and recognize that you're probably going to have to go over it again and maybe again and again. We're really only covering this book. This book is for specialists pretty much, and we're not even covering the footnotes here. You know, the footnotes make up 2/3 of the text. And we're skipping all the footnotes and we're skipping many of the parentheticals just to get a surface reading here. You know, we're trying to use this for our Bible decodes. And so we're trying to get a few nuggets here that will help us decode, in particular, the book of Luke when we get around to it. And so, you know, this is just the first go-round. In order to really understand what he's talking about here, you would have to read this book a few times. But that was the end of chapter 5, and now we're into chapter 6, which is called a Zadokite reconstruction. Our hypothesis is that the Zadokite monastery at Qumran is Sadducean, but not Sadducean according to the portraits in Josephus and the New Testament, which relate to a later period. Well, I don't know how late the period would be if you're talking about the Gospels or the New Testament, but still, we're talking about 30s AD. Josephus is talking about a later period than that, but you know, he's trying to date these documents from the 1st century, so I don't know how late we're talking about. But we were in the BCs just before with, you know, Alexander Junius and Aristobulus and John Hyrcanus. But in like manner, the so-called Karaites of the Middle Ages refer to themselves and are referred to by others as Sadducees. Strikingly enough, they also seem to have used this terminology interchangeably with Zadokites, but have more in common with the Qumran sectaries than they do with what I shall call Herodian or normative Sadduceism. Far from being at odds with the Jerusalem authorities during the Maccabean period, Qumran Sadduceism was in large measure sponsored by them. Therefore, its high point, according to coin data, comes in the John Hyrcanus Alexander Junius period, early 1st century BC. Also, the high point of the Maccabean family priesthood. Its rise is coincident with the split in the later part of John Hyrcanus' reign between the Maccabean family and the Pharisee party, which is carried to an extreme of brutality in the conflict of the Junius period. How then could John Hyrcanus have returned to the Sadducee party? He did so because this was the original party of Judas Maccabee, deserted by his family during the somewhat dubious machinations of his uncle Jonathan and father Simon to curry Seleucid favor for their claims to the high priesthood. The monastery at Qumran was probably the extreme expression of Sadduceism. In the manner of both Daniel and 2nd Maccabees, this extreme and pietistic expression of Sadduceism, embraced by the Hasidian partisans of Judas Maccabee, differed from normative Sadduceism of the Herodian period, which seemed to have more in common with Samaritanism or the Shammai wing of the Pharisee party. In its radical espousal of the relatively new doctrine of resurrection of the dead, or rather resurrection of the pious ones, or the righteous ones. For these were the only ones to whom the privilege applied. All others, in the language of the time, going straight to Sheol, which is, a watered down form of hell. That the Sadducees of the Herodian period did not embrace the doctrine is difficult to understand, except that Herod, after destroying the Maccabean family, brought in a priest from Egypt, Simon ben Boethus, whose daughter he married as he had the Maccabean heiress previously. Because of this, the new priesthood he instituted should more properly be called the Boethusian, as it is often referred to in Talmudic literature. Herod also leased out the priesthood to a variety of other Pharisaic claimants, as the procurators did after him. This importation of foreign claimants is a typical totalitarian or colonial device for controlling local party unrest, and probably is very much evidenced by the pliant Hillel's arrival from Babylon at about this time, coincident with Herod's destruction of the previous classically Sadducean Sanhedrin that had opposed him. Anyone who doubts the flexibility, even the exploitability of the Pharisaic Nasi and Esai and Davidic descendant from Babylon should examine his celebrated innovation of the prosbul and compare the attitude it evinces toward the rich or upper middle classes with the attitude in the letter of James, a true Zadok in the parlance of this period toward these same classes. I think he's referring to Hillel here, although I'm not entirely sure. This book is definitely a handful. A lot of unfamiliar names and semi-familiar names, and again,